Alright, so I wanted to do a little video on this amplifier, the Fender Blues Junior III. This one was bought with an upgrade with a Cannabis Rex speaker. I just did a recent video on what it sounds like if you want to hear it. But I just thought I'd go over the features and how I use the amp and what I think about the amp. Now, so it comes with a 12-inch speaker, and it is a tube amplifier. So it has several tubes in the back. It's one of the cheaper, popular tube amplifiers that are out on the market. So if you're looking for a cheaper tube amp, this might be the one for you. So here we have one input. We have the volume knob, which is basically the preamp knob. And this is where you get basically the knob that allows you to change the amount of gain or distortion or saturation that you hear. So if we put it all the way up to 12, you get a moderately distorted sound. You know, you can get, with this amp, it's not a high gain amp. So if we put the volume, which is basically the preamp or the gain, all the way up to max on this amp, you get a sound that is sort of reminiscent of the heavier Led Zeppelin type sounds. But you won't get more than that out of this amp. So that may be why they call it the Blues Junior, because you won't be able to get like you know, an 80s heavy metal type sound out of this amp. At most you'll get kind of a hard rock 70s amount of distortion out of this amp by itself. Of course, if you add your own pedals on the way in, you can get even more distortion than that. But I'm talking right now about what you can get out of the amp just by plugging a guitar straight in. So in addition to the volume knob, which it's marked volume, but it's basically, you could say, almost a gain knob, you know, how much distortion you hear out of the amp, we have a fat switch which boosts it a tiny bit more. So the highest gain you can get out of the amp is with the volume on 12 and the fat switch engaged. I'm going to jump over to the other knob that controls volume, which is the master. So to basically describe for those of you who are new to how amplification works, like I said, you have the preamplification stage and you have the what's called the amplification stage, or the preamp gets you up to what we call line level, and then the amplification stage, which is controlled here by a knob called master, amplifies it beyond line level via the speaker. So to be very simple, you know, if you want to have with this amplifier a low gain sound, or what we would call a clean sound, you can put like the volume on 2, because 1 on this amp for whatever reason is basically off. You could put like the volume on 2 and bring the master up as high as you want. This amp is pretty loud. It is technically 15 watts. Which, you know, if you are a bass player, you might say 15 watts. Well, that's really quiet. But I'm not somebody who likes to blast out my ears, but, you know, once I get up to, if I leave the volume on 2 and I get the master up to around, you know, 6 or so, I start getting toward a little bit uncomfortable. So if you put, you know, the volume on only 2, the fat knob off, and the master all the way up to 12. I've never done it before, but it gets seriously loud. Certainly not enough, of course, to, you know, to play a medium-sized concert hall or anything like that. But in your bedroom, it's going to get seriously loud. So like I said, for a clean or very low gain sound, the lowest you get with this amp, we put the volume knob on about 2, master maybe up to 6 or so, and you get a typical Fender clean sound. And on the contrary, as I said, if you want to get a really high gain sound, you'll put the master on about 2 maybe, and then you put the volume all the way up, can engage the fat switch, and you kind of like a Led Zeppelin Whole Lotta Love type sound. And of course you can do anything between the two by playing with the fat switch on or off, and then where you have the volume knob. And then I just tend to set the master where I need it to be to get to the overall volume that I want. It does come with a reverb, which is kind of a old school, might be a little bit what you would call muddy for modern day sounds. And so I tend to record this amp with the reverb off, although it is definitely fun to play with the reverb engaged just for some ambience in the room. But for flexibility, when I actually make recordings that I'm going to mix later on, I always leave the reverb off and then use digital reverb in the box. That's that. So lastly, I'll talk about the EQ that this comes with. It comes with 3 knobs, treble, bass, and middle, which I basically find more or less useless, because unfortunately, you know, I initially tried to use the treble, bass, and middle knobs in my recordings to pre-EQ the guitar, but when I do that, it always comes out sounding a little weird. And I was wondering why. You know, when I would decrease the bass, it didn't sound like I was just decreasing the bass. And it's difficult to describe, and I don't know the details of how they, you know, design this circuit. But what I will tell you is that I looked it up, and online I was able to find out that, in fact, when you move the treble knob, it doesn't just affect the treble. It also affects the bass and the mid frequencies that come out of the amp. And it's the same for all 3 knobs, in such a way that I find it not very intuitive or even interesting to play around with that, and I just keep them all in the middle now. And then do my EQ via how I mic the amp or in the box. So how does this amp sound? Well, if you want to hear how it sounds, I gave you some samples in a recent video that I made where I compare the sound of my Fender Blues Junior and my Ibanez TSA-15, both of them tube amps. But qualitatively speaking, if I were to describe the sound of this amp, it is it's not quite as harsh sounding as a transistor amplifier, which is the reason that I really like tube sounds. But on the other hand, for a tube amp, it can get a little harsh and shrill. And so in order to compensate for that, I tend to move when I mic the amp, I tend to put the microphone right on the edge of the speaker cone. If I put it more towards the center of the speaker cone than that, it tends to be a little bit too harsh and shrill, too many upper mids, basically. But I do really appreciate this amp because while it is smoother as tube amps tend to be, and sort of creamier, if you will, it also has a certain amount of bite. So I find this amp particularly good for lead guitar in particular, because it gives it a nice amount of bite that cuts through the mix. And it's also pretty cool for, like I said before, a sort of Led Zeppelin type sound, like Whole Lotta Love or Black Dog, or you know, if you like that kind of sound, which I do, this is a great amp for that kind of, you might call it 70s hard rock, or I don't know what you want to call it. So just to finish up here, this amp does not have an effects loop, which is a shame, which is part of the reason they tried to compensate for it with the reverb. Of course, it would have been nice to have an effects loop, but I think overall it is a pretty good value for the money. I'm happy I bought it. And it is a very nice amp, particularly in the context of recording by itself. Like I said, it can be maybe a little bit, I wouldn't really call it harsh. Like I said, transistor amps tend to be a bit harsher. But for a tube amp, it's a little bit more on the harsh side, I would say, which you can easily compensate for with, you know, depending on how you mic up the cabinet. It doesn't have any direct outs or anything fancy like that, like a lot of more modern type amps would have, and it doesn't have a standby switch either. That's what I was thinking of, yeah. So you do have to, you know, wait a couple seconds when you turn it on before you actually feel the tubes power up enough for you to use it. So you just have to know that you know, when I turn on this amp, often I turn it on and then leave it for a minute or so. You know, a few seconds is enough. You don't have to leave it for a full minute, but if you try to play it in the first first couple seconds after you turn it on, I'm not sure if you could damage it, but you know, the tubes are in flux and you're not going to get any proper sound out of it for the first couple seconds. So just know that if you buy it. You know, a lot of classier tube amps come with a standby switch, therefore, so you can turn it on, leave the standby on, the tubes heat up, but there's no danger to the speakers. So anyway, I think I covered everything on this amp. Like I said, if you want to check out how it sounds, go onto my channel and check out my most recent video where I give you a lot of sound samples of how this amp sounds for different pickup combinations on the electric guitar and different gain level settings so that you can decide if the amp interests you. And once again, like I said, this does have a Cannabis Rex speaker upgrade, so which is going to make it sound a little bit smoother, a little bit better than the stock Blues Junior III speaker that it usually comes with. Alright, that's enough of me blabbing. Have a good day, and I'll put together some chapter markers so you guys can jump around the video to hear what part you want to hear.